Imagine this. You step out into your yard and see footprints in the snow. They lead from the thick of the forest straight to your front door. But there are no tracks leading back to the forest. The trail ends right at your doorstep. That means the person who left them is still inside. He is waiting. 1922. Bavaria. Imagine a place where the silence is so dense it presses against your eardrums, making you hear the blood pounding in your temples. This is the Hinterkaifeck farmstead. It stands isolated, far from the village, surrounded by a dense, dark forest that walls off the farm's inhabitants from the rest of the world. Here, amidst the endless snowy fields, lives the Gruber family. To put it mildly, they were complicated people. Old Andreas Gruber was a hard man, stingy and cruel, feared and disliked by the locals. His daughter Victoria, a widow, a woman with an extinguished gaze, and her 2 children, little Cecilia and baby Josef. They lived a secluded life, letting no one in, and no one was eager to visit them either. The winter that year was particularly brutal. Snow fell for weeks, turning the farm into a white island in a sea of cold. And it was this very snow that became the first witness to the nightmare that was slowly, but inevitably, creeping to their doorstep. It all began in late March. Early one morning, as the sun was just beginning to paint the treetops a pale pink, Andreas went out into the yard. The frost bit at his cheeks, steam rolling from his mouth. The old man scanned his property with a master's eye. Everything seemed normal. The barn locked, the cattle fed, smoke curling from the chimney. But suddenly, his gaze caught something strange in the snow. Stretching straight from the edge of the forest across the entire field, right to their house, was a chain of footprints. Andreas frowned. They weren't expecting guests. The postman came rarely and always from the other side, from the road. But these tracks came straight from the thicket. The old man walked closer, his felt boots crunching on the crust. The tracks were fresh. Someone had walked here quite recently, perhaps during the night or at dawn. They were the prints of heavy men's boots, deep and clear. Andreas, a suspicious and distrustful man, decided to track the path of this uninvited guest. He followed the chain of footprints, gripping the handle of a knife in his pocket. The trail led straight to the back wall of the house, to the engine room where the diesel motor stood. The old man walked around the house. He expected to see where this person had gone. Maybe it was a drifter begging for food, or a thief eyeing the tools. But the more Andreas walked, the colder he felt inside. There were no return tracks. The chain broke off at the wall of the house. A man came from the forest. A man walked up to the house. And the man vanished? No, that's impossible. Andreas carefully examined the snow around him. No other prints. The snow cover was pristine. That meant the one who left these tracks either learned to fly or he was still here. Right now. The old man raised his head and looked at the attic window. It was dark and empty, like the eye socket of a skull. Did he imagine it? Or did something flicker behind the dirty glass? A shadow? He spat, driving away the bad thoughts. Just my imagination, he grumbled under his nose. Getting old. But anxiety had already lodged itself in his heart like a splinter of ice. He returned to the house, slamming the door loudly to show who was boss here. He said nothing to the women. Why scare them? Besides, he didn't like sharing his thoughts. He simply took his old hunting rifle, checked the ammo, and placed it in the corner, closer to the bed. Just in case, he thought. But the strangeness didn't end there. That same evening, Andreas went to the barn. He needed to check the locks. He remembered personally locking the tool shed with a heavy padlock yesterday. He approached the door and froze. The door was ajar. The lock had been smashed off. Deep scratches were visible on the iron hinges as if someone had been picking at them with a nail or a knife. The old man went inside, lighting a kerosene lamp. Shadows danced on the walls, turning rakes and shovels into monsters. He checked the shelves. Axes, saws, hammers. Everything seemed to be in place, but something was missing. He went through the ring of keys that always hung on a nail by the entrance. The house keys were gone. The ring had vanished. Andreas felt a chill run down his spine. Who could have taken the keys? His daughter? Unlikely. She knew her father didn't like his things being touched. The grandkids? They were too small to reach the nail. That meant it was a stranger. The one who came from the forest. The one whose tracks ended at the wall. Andreas rushed out of the barn, shining his lantern into every corner. "Hey!" he shouted into the darkness. "Who's there? Come out! I'll shoot!" But the only answer was silence. The wind howled in the chimney, swaying the old spruce trees. No one replied. No one ran. The farm seemed dead. But that feeling, the feeling of a stranger's gaze, it drilled into the back of his head. Someone was watching him. From the darkness of the attic. From around the corner of the barn. The old man returned to the house, bolted all the doors, and barricaded them with chairs. That night, he barely slept. He lay there, listening to the sounds of the house. An old wooden house always lives its own life. Floorboards creak, logs crack from the frost. But on this night, the sounds were different. Overhead in the attic, something was happening. It wasn't mice. Mice scratched lightly and quickly. This was a heavy sound, like someone cautiously shifting from foot to foot, trying not to make noise. Creak. Silence. Creak again. And the rustling of hay. Andreas gripped the rifle until his knuckles turned white. He knew every centimeter of that attic. Only hay for the cattle, old furniture, and rags were stored there. There shouldn't be anyone there. In the morning, the first thing he did was climb up. The ladder creaked under his weight. He threw open the hatch, ready to shoot at any shadow. But the attic was empty. Sunbeams pierced through cracks in the roof, illuminating dust dancing in the air. The piles of hay lay still. The old man walked around the entire attic. No one. But then he noticed a detail that made his breath catch. In the corner, behind an old wardrobe, the hay was flattened. Not just scattered, but specifically pressed down, as if someone had made a bed there, as if a human had curled up to keep warm. And nearby lay scraps of food, bread crusts that had clearly been stolen from their kitchen. So, he wasn't crazy. There was someone else in the house, an invisible man, a ghost, or a person who knew how to hide better than any animal. Andreas climbed down, pale as a sheet, but pride wouldn't let him admit his fear. He decided to stay silent. "I'll catch him," he thought with anger. "The rat will walk into the trap." The next day, an event occurred that finally knocked the ground from under his feet. In the morning, stepping onto the porch, Andreas found a newspaper on the steps. It was a Munich newspaper, a publication no one in their backwoods read. The postman hadn't brought it. They didn't subscribe to it. Where did it come from? The paper was fresh, just a couple of days from the press. Who brought it here? Through the forest? Through deep snow? And why place it on the porch? It looks like a mockery, like a message. I am here. I am close. I read the news while you sleep. Andreas crumpled the newspaper and threw it into the stove. The fire greedily licked the paper, devouring the letters. But it was impossible to burn the fear. The atmosphere in the house was heating up. Victoria, the daughter, was walking around like a ghost herself. She felt something too. "Father," she said one evening as they dined by the light of a dim lamp, "last night I heard footsteps, right above my head. And then someone pulled the handle of my door." Andreas slammed his fist on the table. "Enough!" he barked. "It's the wind! The old house is drying out. There's no one here." He shouted to drown out his own voice of reason. He shouted because he was terrified himself, to the point of trembling. Because if he admitted that someone was walking in the house, he'd have to admit they were trapped. There was nowhere to run. Kilometers of snowy wilderness lay between them and the nearest neighbors. And the enemy was already inside. The horror truly began when the new maid, Maria, arrived. The previous one had fled 6 months ago, crossing herself and muttering that the farm was unclean, that someone was watching her. Maria was a simple, sturdy woman, not prone to fantasies. She arrived on Friday, March 31st, on the last day of their lives. She unpacked her things in a small room next to the kitchen. All day she bustled about the house, trying to ignore the gloominess of the hosts. But in the evening, when the house plunged into sleep, Maria couldn't close her eyes. It seemed to her that from behind the wall, from the very tool closet where the tools were kept, came a whisper. A quiet, unintelligible whisper. And breathing. The heavy, wheezing breath of a man standing right behind the thin partition. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, praying for morning to come. She didn't know that this morning would be her last. She didn't know that the one breathing behind the wall had long since studied their schedule. He knew when they ate, when they slept, when they went to milk the cows. He lived one life with them, remaining in the shadows. He was like a parasite that had infiltrated a body and waited for the right moment to strike. And that moment arrived. In the evening, when twilight thickened over the Hinterkaifeck farm, suddenly something crashed in the barn. The sound was loud, sharp, like something heavy falling. Andreas, sitting by the stove, raised his head. "The cattle are acting up again," he grumbled. He reluctantly stood up, threw a sheepskin coat over his shoulders, and took a lantern. "I'll go look," he told the women. He opened the door and stepped into the darkness of the yard. Snow crunched under his feet. The wind threw icy grit into his face. Andreas walked to the barn, unaware that every step was a step into his grave. He approached the doors, opened them, and went inside. The lantern light snatched hay, firewood, and sleeping cows from the gloom. Everything seemed calm. But what then had crashed? The old man walked deeper to where the chaff cutter stood. And there, in the thick shadow, he saw movement. Someone was standing behind a pillar. "Who's there?" Andreas shouted, raising the lantern. And at that moment the shadow detached itself from the wall. It was a man, tall, his face hidden by a cloth. In his hands, he held something heavy, a mattock, an old, rusty mattock used for breaking frozen ground. Andreas didn't even have time to scream. The blow was terrible. The blade crunched into his skull, tearing skin and bone. The old man collapsed into the hay like a felled oak. The lantern fell nearby, the glass shattered, and the flame hissed, but didn't die. The killer stood over the body, breathing heavily. He didn't rush. He knew no one would come running to the sound immediately. He wiped the blade on the old man's pant leg and froze, listening. Silence in the house. The women were waiting. They thought father was simply tending to the livestock. But time passed. 10 minutes. 20. Andreas still hadn't returned. Victoria got worried. "I'll go see what's happening," she told her mother. She threw on a shawl and went out onto the porch. "Papa!" she called into the darkness. Silence. Only the wind whistling. She went down the steps and walked to the barn, following her father's path step for step. She entered the open doors. "Papa, are you here?" Her voice trembled. She saw the light of the lantern lying on the floor. She took another step and saw her father's boot sticking out of the hay. "Oh my God!" She rushed to him, thinking he had a heart attack. She fell to her knees before him, turned him over, and saw a bloody mask instead of a face. The scream got stuck in her throat, because at that moment, a floorboard creaked behind her back. She spun around sharply. A shadow loomed over her, blocking out the whole world. The mattock flew up, glinting in the dim light. Strike. Another one. Victoria fell next to her father. Now there were two of them. The killer coolly covered them with hay, as if tucking them in to sleep. He froze again. There were still people in the house. Old Shazilia, Victoria's mother, and the little granddaughter, also Shazilia, 7 years old. They were waiting. Worry was growing into panic. Why was no one returning? The old woman took the girl by the hand. "Come, dear. Let's see where they all disappeared to." It was a fatal mistake. The Gruber family walked to the slaughter one by one, like sheep obediently going to the butcher. They entered the barn together. The girl saw her mother's legs sticking out from under the hay and screamed. This scream was short. The killer knew no pity. He dispatched the old woman with one blow. But with the girl, it was worse. She didn't die immediately. In panic, stunned, with a shattered head, she lay next to her dead mother and grandmother, tearing her hair out in clumps, clutching it in her fists. She lay dying in agony for several hours. And the killer stood and watched. Or perhaps he went to the house. After all, two more remained there. The new maid Maria, who was sleeping in her room, and baby Joseph in the carriage. The work was not yet finished. He stepped over the bodies, wiped the mattock on the snow by the threshold, and entered the house. Now he was the master here. The floors creaked under his steps, but now he didn't need to hide. He walked confidently. He was going to kill the sleepers. The door to Maria's room was unlocked, and this became the fatal error that determined the outcome of this terrible night. The killer pushed the panel, and the old hinges let out a quiet, pitiful groan that drowned in the noise of the wind outside the window. Maria, tired after her first day of work, slept a heavy sleep, covered with a down comforter up to her chin. The room smelled of dried lavender and old wood, and this peaceful smell of home contrasted sharply with the horror that had crossed the threshold. The man with the mattock moved silently, like a shadow. He knew this house better than the owners themselves, for he had watched them for weeks, studying every floorboard. He approached the head of the bed. There was no hesitation in his movements, no pity, only cold, mechanical calculation. The heavy tool swept upward, barely missing the low ceiling. The blow was dull and terrible. Maria didn't even have time to wake up. Her life was cut short in an instant, turning sleep into eternity. Now, only one living person remained in the house besides the killer himself. Little Joseph, Victoria's son. He was only 2.5 years old. He was sleeping in the parents' bedroom in a wicker carriage standing next to his mother's huge, empty bed. The killer walked down the corridor, leaving bloody footprints from his rough boots on the floor. He entered the bedroom where the clock ticked, measuring out the last seconds of the child's life. The shadow loomed over the carriage. The killer looked inside. The boy slept, arms spread out, trustingly and serenely. But for the one holding the bloodied mattock, this was not a child. This was an extra witness, a hindrance to be eliminated. The blow was of such force that it shattered the carriage's hood. The silence in the house became absolute. 6 people were dead. It would seem this is where it should all end. The criminal should grab the money, of which there was plenty in the house, and flee into the forest, escaping justice. But what happened next does not fit into the mind of a normal person and turns this crime into an act of transcendent madness. The killer didn't leave. He calmly wiped the blood from his hands with a rag found in the kitchen. He felt tired after the work and hungry. He found bread, cut himself some sausage, took brandy from the cupboard, and had a feast, sitting at the table surrounded by dead silence. He ate, drank, and stared into the dark window, feeling like the rightful master of the farm. And then he went to sleep. Right there, in the house where the bodies of his victims lay in the neighboring rooms and in the barn. He spent not just one night in this house. He lived there for 3 days. For 3 long days, smoke curled from the chimney, creating the illusion of life. The killer stoked the stove so as not to freeze. He cooked himself food. But the most striking thing, he fed the cattle. The cows in the barn began to moo from hunger, and the killer, stepping over the mountain of corpses of Andreas, Victoria, and the old woman, poured them feed. He milked them so the animals wouldn't suffer from pain, and then drank that milk in the kitchen. It was some kind of monstrous household ritual. He even tied the dog, a Spitz, in the barn so it wouldn't run away. During all these days, people approached the farm, but the killer, like an invisible spider, watched them from cover. On April 1st, coffee sellers Hans and Edward came. They knocked on windows, shouted, called the owners, but only silence answered them. The killer stood behind the curtain, gripping a knife, ready to attack if they dared to enter. But they left. On Sunday, the family didn't come to church, which surprised the neighbors, but no one decided to check. On April 4th, the mechanic Albert Hoffner came to fix the chaff cutter engine. He worked for a whole hour in the yard and in the engine room. He whistled, clanged tools, even had a snack sitting on the threshold of the house. He didn't know that behind the door, just a couple of meters from his back, lay the murdered Maria, and from the darkness of the attic or window, a pair of cold eyes watched him. Hoffner fixed the engine, started it, and left, never having met a single living soul. But it was the sound of the running engine that became the signal for the neighbors. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who lived nearby, noticed that the chimney was smoking. The engine was running, but no people had been seen for 4 days. The postman also complained that the mail wasn't being picked up. The anxiety that had been accumulating all this time grew into certainty. Trouble had happened. Lorenz gathered 2 men, Jakob Sigel and Michael Pearl, and they moved toward the farm. It was April 5th. The snow was already melting, turning into a dirty mess. The farm stood dark and ominous. The dog in the barn barked, hearing strangers. The men approached the barn doors. Lorenz pushed the heavy panel. A thick, nauseating smell of decomposition mixed with the smell of manure hit his nose. In the gloom, they saw a strange pile of hay. A human leg was sticking out from under it. Lorenz, overcoming horror, threw back the hay. A scene from hell opened up before them. 4 bodies lay on top of each other, like dolls thrown into a heap. The faces of old Andreas and Cecilia were smashed beyond recognition. Victoria lay nearby, and the most terrifying detail, the one that made the men's legs give way, little 7-year-old Cecilia. Forensics would later show she lived for several hours after the attack. In agony, stunned and maddened by pain, she had torn her own hair out, clutching it in her fists. She died slowly, next to the corpses of her family. Horrified, the men rushed into the house, hoping to find survivors there. But the corridor met them with emptiness. In the kitchen stood dirty dishes, the remnants of the killer's feast. The door to the maid's room was open. There, on the bed, lay Maria. And in the bedroom, in the shattered carriage, they found little Joseph. 6 lives had been wiped from the face of the earth. The police, arriving from Munich, were at a dead end. At first, they thought it was a robbery. But during the search, huge sums of money, gold coins, jewelry, and mortgage bonds were found in the house. All this lay in accessible places, in unlocked dresser drawers. The killer didn't take a single pfennig. He didn't come for wealth. He came to exterminate the Gruber family. The investigation was conducted with incredible thoroughness, but also with monstrous errors. The heads of the victims were separated from the bodies and sent to Munich to clairvoyants, hoping they would point to the killer. But the mediums remained silent. Thousands of interrogations, hundreds of suspects, from drifters to Lorenz Schlittenbauer himself, who had a motive. He was Victoria's lover and possibly the child's father. But no evidence was found. The killer seemed to dissolve into thin air. He left just as he came, through the forest, leaving behind only a riddle. Who was it? A mad avenger? A psychopathic drifter? Or someone close who hated old man Gruber enough to live for 3 days in a house with his corpse? The Hinterkaifeck farm was demolished a year after the tragedy. People feared this place. But even when the walls fell, the fear remained. Local residents still say that in the forest, on the site of the former homestead, you can sometimes see footprints in the snow. Tracks that lead from the thicket to the empty field, but never return. This was a story about how the scariest monsters aren't ghosts or demons. They are people who live among us, breathe the same air as us, and sometimes hide in our attics. March 31st, 1922. Friday. The day at Hinterkaifeck was fading, giving way to twilight, which seemed particularly thick and ominous that evening. The wind whistled in the chimney, as if warning the inhabitants of the house about trouble, but they were busy with their usual routine. Chores had to be finished before dark. The chain of fatal events was first triggered by old Andreas Gruber. Sitting in the kitchen, he suddenly became alert. It seemed to him that a strange sound came from the barn, a dull thud, as if something heavy had fallen onto the earthen floor. Or maybe it was a door torn off its hinges, creaking. "Something's wrong there again," grumbled Andreas. He didn't like disorder. He threw a heavy sheepskin coat over his shoulders, took a kerosene lantern in his hands, and stepped into the cold corridor leading to the barn. "I'll be quick," he told the women, not knowing these were the last words of his life. The old man opened the barn door. The warm, moist smell of manure and rotting hay hit his nose. The cows in the stalls were behaving restlessly. They shifted from foot to foot, mooed dully, and looked askance at the dark corner where the tools were stored. Andreas raised the lantern higher. The light snatched rakes, pitchforks, and mountains of straw from the gloom. Everything seemed to be in place. But instinct, that animal fear that had plagued him for the last few days, wailed inside like a siren. A shadow flickered behind a massive wooden pillar. Andreas opened his mouth to call out to the stranger but didn't have time to make a sound. The shadow detached itself from the wall with frightening speed. In the killer's hands flashed a heavy mattock, a rough tool for breaking stone and ice. The blow was of monstrous force. The point entered the old man's skull, instantly cutting off his thoughts. Andreas collapsed into the straw, dropping the lantern. The glass cracked, but the wick didn't go out, continuing to cast trembling, dancing shadows on the walls. The killer coolly dragged the body to the side and threw an armful of hay over it. He didn't intend to run. He began to wait. 10 minutes passed. 20. An anxious silence hung in the kitchen. Father still hadn't returned. Victoria, Andreas's daughter, began to get nervous. "Where did he go?" she asked her mother. "I'll go look." She threw on a shawl and went out into the same corridor, her heels clicking on the boards. She walked quickly, confidently, straight into the set trap. She entered the barn. "Papa," she called in the semi-darkness. The only answer was the whistling of the wind in the cracks. She saw the lantern lying on the floor. That was strange. Father was meticulous and never dropped things. Victoria took a step forward, leaned down, and saw her father's boot sticking out of the hay. Horror hit her chest like an icy wave. She opened her mouth to scream, but the killer was already standing behind her back. A second blow. The second body fell next to the first. The mechanism of death worked without failure. The criminal again threw hay over them, hiding the traces. Now only women and children remained in the house. Old Shazilia Gruber, Victoria's mother, couldn't find a place for herself. Her heart sensed trouble. 7-year-old granddaughter, little Shazilia, hovered nearby. The girl tugged at her grandmother's sleeve. "Grandma, I'm scared," she whispered. "Come, dear. Let's find them," the old woman said. It was a terrible mistake. They went together. The old hand squeezed the child's palm. They walked the same path of death. They entered the barn, where the lantern was already burning out, glowing like a red ember. The old woman squinted blindly. She stumbled over something soft. It was her daughter's arm. At that moment, a figure with a mattock rose from the darkness. The killer spared no one. The blow to the old woman was quick. She fell dead. But with the girl, it turned out differently. In panic, stunned by the blow, but still alive, she fell next to the bodies of her relatives. Later, experts would establish a gruesome fact. Little Shazilia lived for several more hours. In the dark, among the corpses, choking on pain and horror, she tore at her own hair. She pulled out whole clumps. She died slowly, hearing the killer walking nearby, but not daring to call for help. And the killer finished in the barn. 4 bodies lay in a pile, but he knew. There were 2 more in the house. He wiped the mattock on the straw, but the handle became sticky with blood. He left the barn and headed to the living part of the house. Now he walked like a master. The floorboards creaked under his boots, leaving bloody tracks. He passed through the kitchen, which still smelled deliciously of dinner. He headed to the room of the new maid, Maria Baumgartner. Maria had arrived at the farm just a few hours ago. She was so tired from the road that she went to bed early and didn't even lock the door. She slept, dreaming of a new life, unaware that her first day on the job was her last. The killer pushed the door. Moonlight fell on the bed. One precise blow with the point to the temple. Maria died instantly, in her sleep. 5 victims. The last one remained. 2-year-old Joseph. He slept in his mother's bedroom in a large wicker carriage. The killer entered the main bedroom, where the clock ticked loudly. Victoria's huge bed was empty. The killer approached the carriage. The child slept, arms spread out. For the man with the mattock, this wasn't a child, but merely a witness. Unnecessary noise. A swing. The blow destroyed both the carriage and the little life. That was it. Silence. Absolute, dead silence covered Hinterkaifeck. 6 people were dead. But what happened next is scarier than the murders themselves. A normal person would run from there without looking back. But this one, he calmly put the mattock in the corner. He went to the kitchen, found a rag, wiped the blood from his hands. He felt hunger. Soup stood on the table. The killer sat at the table, pulled over a dead man's plate, and began to eat. He ate bread. He found brandy in the cupboard and drank. He sat in a house full of corpses and simply had dinner. He felt at home here. And then he went to sleep. He didn't go into the forest. He stayed the night. He lived on the farm with the corpses for 3 more days. He stoked the stove so the neighbors would see smoke. He cooked himself food. And the maddest thing, he fed the cattle. The cows mooed, and the killer went out to the barn, stepped over the mountain of his victims' bodies, and poured feed for the animals. He even milked them, and then drank that milk in the kitchen. It was transcendent cold-bloodedness. All these days people approached the house, knocked, but he watched them from behind the curtain, gripping a knife. He played a terrible game. I am here, but you don't see me. He left only when he realized the game had dragged on, leaving behind an unsolved mystery and 6 graves. April 4th, 1922 arrived. Tuesday. A heavy, oppressive silence hung over the Hinterkaifeck farm, broken only by the barking of the dog locked in the barn. Residents of the surrounding farms had already begun to whisper. Too many oddities had piled up over these days. The postman complained that Saturday's mail still lay untouched on the kitchen windowsill. The mechanic Albert Hoffner, who fixed the engine in the yard, cursed that none of the owners came out to accept the work, although someone was clearly in the house. And most importantly, the smoke. Neighbors saw smoke rising from the chimney all these days. That meant the stove was being stoked. That meant life was going on there. But why then didn't the Grubers come to church on Sunday? Why didn't they let the cattle out into the pen? Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor living nearby, could no longer tolerate this uncertainty. He was bound to this family by complex, tangled relationships, and his heart told him that something irreparable had happened. He gathered 2 fellow villagers, Jakob Siegel and Michael Pearl. "Men," he said gloomily, looking at the dark windows of the farm. "Let's go check. I don't like any of this. The dog is howling as if it smells a corpse." Around 5 in the evening, the 3 men moved toward the homestead. The road was messy from the spring thaw. Feet got stuck in the mud, but they walked quickly. The farm met them with closed doors. Everything seemed extinct. But that was a deception. Inside this silent house hid a nightmare they were about to see. They approached the engine room. The door was ajar. Schlittenbauer went first. He pushed the heavy barn panel. The hinges creaked, letting the people inside. Immediately, a thick, heavy smell hit their noses. A mixture of manure, rotting hay, and the sweetish, nauseating aroma of decomposition. In the semi-darkness of the barn, it was quiet. Only the cows breathed heavily in their stalls. The men illuminated the space with a lantern. The beam of light snatched a pile of straw and hay piled in the corner, not far from the door. It looked strange, messy, as if someone was in a hurry. A human leg and a rough boot stuck out from under the pile. Lorenz froze. He recognized that boot. It belonged to Andreas Gruber. Overcoming the trembling in their hands, the neighbors approached closer and began to rake away the hay. What was revealed to their eyes would turn anyone's hair gray. Bodies lay on top of each other, like sacks thrown into a heap. The faces of Andreas and his wife Cecilia were smashed beyond recognition, turned into a bloody mess. Victoria lay nearby, and the creepiest thing, little 7-year-old Cecilia. Her face was frozen in a mask of transcendent horror. In her dead, stiffened fists, she clutched clumps of her own hair. This meant the girl didn't die immediately. She woke up in the dark, among the corpses, and going mad with pain and fear, tore at her hair while life slowly left her body. The men recoiled. Jakob Sigel vomited right on the floor. "In the house!" shouted Lorenz in a voice not his own. "There are 2 more there. The baby and the maid." They rushed to the door leading to the living area. The key was in the lock from the inside. The killer locked the door before leaving so no one would find the bodies right away. Lorenz broke the door down with his shoulder. The corridor met them with emptiness and cold. They ran into the kitchen. On the table stood 3 plates with leftover food, bread, a knife. Someone had dined here quite recently. Calmly sat down, ate, drank, looking at the door behind which lay a mountain of dead bodies. It was a spit in the face of all human laws. Lorenz rushed to Maria's bedroom. She lay on the bed covered with a blanket as if asleep. The blow was delivered precisely to the temple. She didn't even move. The last hope remained for little Joseph. The neighbors ran into the main bedroom. The carriage was overturned and smashed. The child was dead. His head was pierced by the same heavy object, the mattock. 6 monstrous murders, not a single witness, and absolute, ringing silence. The police from Munich arrived only a few hours later. And here begins the second part of this nightmare, the investigation, which became a series of errors and mystical coincidences. The policemen, instead of cordoning off the crime scene, behaved like bulls in a china shop. They trampled footprints in the yard, touched things, moved objects. Moreover, they sat down to have dinner in the very same kitchen. Yes, this is a historical fact. The police ate the food the killer had left on the table and drank wine from the Gruber cellar while the body still lay in the barn. It was the height of unprofessionalism. But the strangest thing became clear during the search. Detective Georg Reingruber, who led the case, expected it to be a robbery. The farm was wealthy, Andreas was known to be stingy, there was money. The police began looking for stashes, and they found them. In unlocked dresser drawers, in tin cans, under mattresses lay money. Huge sums. Thousands of paper marks, gold coins, jewelry, mortgage bonds. All this lay in plain sight. The killer, who lived here for 3 days, could have taken everything. He could have walked out with a fortune. But he didn't take a single pfennig. Money didn't interest him. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution. A personal, cruel revenge or the act of a mad maniac for whom life has no price. The investigation reached a dead end. Everyone fell under suspicion. Drifters, neighbors, and Lorenz Schlittenbauer himself. He was interrogated intensely as he knew the layout of the house and was Victoria's lover. But no evidence was found. The investigation went so poorly that the police decided on a step that makes the blood run cold. The heads of all 6 victims were separated from the bodies and sent to Munich, to famous clairvoyants. The police hoped that mediums could read the last thoughts of the murdered and name the criminal. It sounds like nonsense, but in 1922, it was reality. Of course, the heads remained silent. The clairvoyants saw nothing, and the skulls were lost somewhere in the archives during World War II. The bodies were buried headless. The killer was never found. He left the house as unnoticed as he came. The footprint in the snow that once led to the house had long melted. No one ever found tracks leading back to the forest. Perhaps he walked away down the road, blending into the crowd, with you, with us. The Hinterkaifeck farm stood for another year. People bypassed it. They said that at night lights were seen in the empty windows, that footsteps were heard from the attic. In 1923, people couldn't take it anymore and demolished the cursed house to the ground. Now a flat field stretches across this place. There stands only a small chapel with the names carved on it: Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, Little Cecilia, Joseph, Maria. But even now, 100 years later, locals don't like to go there after sunset. They say that if you listen closely, in the noise of the wind, you can hear the thud of a mattock on frozen earth and the heavy footsteps of the man who came from the forest to stay forever. The story of Hinterkaifeck is not just a detective story. It is a reminder that evil does not always need a motive. Sometimes it just comes, tramples your floor with dirty boots, eats your food, and sleeps in your bed while you are dead. And the scariest thing, it can be anywhere, right now. This case has remained a cold case for 100 years. It proves only one thing: the scariest monsters are not ghosts. They are ordinary people who live among us. They breathe our air, walk our streets, and sometimes come to visit us uninvited. Thanks for watching to the end. If you liked it, hit the subscribe button. See you in the next nightmare.